You won't believe what just unfolded in Washington. Donald Trump and his Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent thought they had designed the perfect strategy to corner China. The goal was simple: squeeze Beijing until it had no choice but to back down. But China didn't retreat. Instead, it deepened its partnership with Russia, signing even larger oil deals that made Washington's pressure campaign look toothless. And here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Scott Bessent, the very man behind this strategy, is now taking a different position.
Pre-invasion, 13% of China's oil was already coming from Russia. Now it's 16%, so China has a diversified input of their oil.
Suddenly, he's defending China's right to keep buying Russian oil, arguing that Beijing has always traded with Moscow and that nothing has really changed. Yet, when the conversation shifts to India, his tone changes. On India, Bessent is openly critical, suggesting New Delhi is only out to profit.
India is just profiteering, or they are just profiteering, they are reselling. They've made $16 billion in excess profits, some of the richest families in India.
That double standard reveals something important. The Trump administration appears to be easing off China while turning its firepower on India instead. This shift raises bigger questions. If Washington is no longer confident about challenging China directly, then who is really paying the cost of these policies? America's high-tech ambitions, artificial intelligence, advanced chips, semiconductors, still rely heavily on rare earth minerals controlled by Beijing. If China ever decides to tighten supply, Silicon Valley could find itself paralyzed in a matter of days. Meanwhile, Japan, once seen as America's most reliable partner in Asia, is struggling under tariffs that have cut into exports and rattled its financial markets. So we have to ask, if this entire plan was meant to strengthen the United States, why are farmers, tech companies, and even close allies feeling the pain instead? Before we dive into the details of how all of this is playing out, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss any of our deep dives into the global economy. Now, let's take a closer look at what's really going on. Let's step back and look at what these sanctions are really about. On the surface, the White House has been saying they're aimed at punishing Russia. But from the beginning, Trump himself made it clear that Moscow wasn't America's biggest concern. He pointed directly at China. That alone explains how these sanctions were written, broad enough to target not just Russia, but any country Washington chooses. And the first real test case wasn't Russia at all. It was China. This was also one of the main campaign points from J.D. Vance.
I happen to think the biggest threat to American democracy today is big technology companies in bed with the communist Chinese who are censoring information about American politics.
Inside Trump's circle, the strategy looked straightforward. If they could cut China off from cheap Russian oil and gas, the cost of running Chinese factories would soar. That would push up the price of Chinese goods, and maybe, just maybe, American companies would finally be able to compete. But when the plan was put into action, it didn't unfold the way Washington expected. China found a way around it. Instead of buying less Russian oil, it kept buying more, but shifted payments into yuan instead of dollars. That move didn't just protect Beijing's energy supply, it chipped away at the dollar's global role. And while doing that, China also drew closer to Iran, Saudi Arabia, and other big exporters, building a wider network of partners to secure its fuel for the long term. For Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary helping to drive this policy, the warning signs were hard to ignore. The United States had miscalculated. Instead of forcing China into retreat, the pressure backfired, and American sectors started to feel the strain. Farmers suddenly couldn't sell their soybeans because their biggest buyer was gone. Companies dependent on Chinese supply chains panicked, realizing there was no quick replacement. And when the White House threatened new tariffs, the deadlines kept slipping. First 90 days, then 120, then another 90. Months of delay piled up. If Washington was confident, it would have moved forward. The hesitation showed that the costs were too high to lock those tariffs in permanently. And so, the focus shifted. Not to China, but to India. That's the irony. India has been one of America's most reliable partners in recent years. It welcomed US investment, opened its markets, and even became Apple's new production hub after the company poured billions into shifting iPhone manufacturing away from China. For Apple, India was supposed to be the safe bet. But Washington's actions are turning that bet upside down. The same sanctions that were marketed as punishment for Russia are now being turned toward New Delhi. Not because India suddenly poses a threat, but because China has become too costly to confront directly. India is easier to pressure. Even major outlets have started to point out the contradiction. Why does Washington go soft on Beijing while tightening the screws on New Delhi? And once again, Scott Bessent's role is telling. On China, he has softened his words, avoiding any comment that might derail fragile negotiations. On India, his language has been sharper, suggesting profiteering and opportunism. It's a clear signal of where Washington believes it has leverage and where it doesn't. The reality is plain. Sanctions that were introduced as tools against Russia have become instruments Washington wields against whichever country it feels it can squeeze. And right now, India is the one caught in the middle. Now let's take a closer look at why Washington is so cautious with China. One of the biggest reasons lies in the American Farm Belt. US farmers depend heavily on Chinese buyers, and when Beijing cut soybean purchases in response to earlier tariffs, the impact was immediate. Across the Midwest, silos filled with unsold crops, and farmers faced the real possibility of collapse. Washington scrambled to provide billions in subsidies just to keep them afloat. The stakes here are enormous. At its height, China was purchasing more than $26 billion of American agricultural products in a single year. Nearly 1 out of every 3 rows of soybeans grown in the United States ended up in China. No other market even comes close to taking that volume. If that door were to close completely, the consequences would spread far beyond individual farms. Debt among US farmers is already climbing, and profit margins are razor thin. A full cutoff from China would drive crop prices down, force families in states like Iowa, Illinois, and Nebraska to sell at a loss, and push many toward bankruptcy. Subsidies could soften the blow temporarily, but no government program can fully replace a market as large as China. And it's not just about today's numbers, it's about the future. For young farmers inheriting land, the message would be bleak. The most important customer is gone. Without China, America's agricultural heartland risks hollowing out, while rivals like Brazil and Russia take over the role of feeding the world. The fallout would ripple far beyond the countryside, hitting equipment makers like John Deere, logistics firms, and exporters tied to US ports. The farm sector isn't the only pressure point. US corporations also depend on Chinese factories, not just for low-cost labor, but for entire networks of suppliers and production lines that cannot simply be recreated somewhere else. And then there's the rare earth question. China dominates the mining and processing of the minerals essential for smartphones, electric cars, and even US military hardware. Without them, American production would stall in a matter of weeks. Trump himself made this link clear the last time tariffs on China were paused. The White House wanted assurance that rare earth exports would continue flowing. Beijing provided that assurance, and the tariffs were quietly pushed back. Meanwhile, American companies that thought they had sidestepped the problem by moving to India are discovering that they're still vulnerable. Apple invested billions setting up new factories there, believing India would be protected from Washington's trade wars. But recent moves show that even close partners can be dragged into the same fight. For Apple and others, the message is clear. Moving operations doesn't guarantee safety when US policy itself keeps shifting. Look at the bigger picture, and the pattern becomes obvious. Russia may be the name on the sanctions, but China has always been the real focus. And now India is being pulled into the crossfire. The repeated delays on tariffs, the careful defense of Beijing by Scott Bessent, and the reluctance to push too far all reveal the same truth. Washington knows it cannot afford an open clash with China. Instead, it shifts the pressure to partners who are easier to push around. When we look across Asia, the picture isn't just about China or India. Japan, America's closest ally in the region, is now facing its own storm, and Washington's policies are a big part of it. The latest economic data tells a troubling story. Exports, inflation, debt, and demographics are all pointing in the wrong direction. And instead of stabilizing Japan, US trade decisions are adding new pressure. Let's start with exports. In July, Japan's overseas sales fell by 2.6% compared to last year, the steepest decline in 4 years. For an economy that depends on selling cars, machinery, and electronics abroad, that's a serious warning. The biggest drop came from the American market. Shipments to the US collapsed by more than 10% in just 12 months. Sales to China also fell, but the tariffs Washington placed on Japanese cars are what cut deepest. A new deal was announced only days ago to reduce those tariffs from 25% down to 15%. But it's worth remembering that just a few years back, Japanese car makers paid only 2.5%. Even after this concession, they're still paying 6 times more than before. Toyota, Honda, and Nissan can't simply pass the costs to American consumers without losing market share, so they're absorbing them. That means thinner profits, and at some point, they'll be forced to choose between raising prices in the US or cutting jobs and production at home. The trade picture doesn't end with cars. When auto exports slow, the entire balance shifts. Instead of running a surplus in July, Japan posted a deficit of 117.5 billion yen, roughly $795 million. That reversal shows how vulnerable the economy has become. Then comes inflation. Core prices in July stood at 3.1%. That's slightly lower than June, but still well above the Bank of Japan's 2% target. Families are feeling it most in the grocery store, where food prices are up more than 8%. For ordinary households, paychecks simply aren't keeping pace. Energy costs finally eased a little, but that relief is minor compared to what families are paying for food. And now the central bank faces an impossible choice. Raising interest rates could bring inflation down, but higher rates would also weigh on exports and industries already squeezed by US tariffs. If policymakers hold back, households suffer. If they move forward, businesses take the hit. Either way, the strain deepens. Put all of this together: shrinking exports, stubborn inflation, record debt, and a workforce in long-term decline, and it becomes clear that Japan is being cornered. Immigration reforms have been too limited to offset demographic decline, and financial markets are already uneasy about Japan's debt load. With Washington's trade barriers cutting into Japan's core industries, the country is being forced to fight battles on every front at once. The irony here is striking. The tariffs were supposed to strengthen American industry and weaken China. Instead, they've left Japan stuck in the middle. Its exports squeezed, its companies under pressure, and its alliance with Washington carrying heavier economic costs than benefits. And if Japan falters too much, the shockwaves won't stay in Tokyo. They'll spill into supply chains, financial markets, and even the US economy itself. That's why this story matters. Japan's crisis is not isolated. It's tied directly to decisions made in Washington. And if those decisions continue on their current path, the next economic tremors could hit not just Asia, but the United States as well. So here's the real question. If America's allies are cracking, and its farmers and tech firms are suffering, who is really winning this trade war? Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss our next breakdown of the forces reshaping the global economy.